Hi, and welcome back to U.S. History with Mr. Snyder, and today we're going to talk about Reagan's domestic policies of the 1980s. So conservatives are very, very happy that Ronald Reagan gets elected. Some even refer to it as the Reagan Revolution, and it brings a significant shift in the political direction of this nation. There's a big recession going on, and an even bigger one when Reagan takes office. So Reagan uses supply-side economics to fix the economy. It's also known as Reaganomics. What does that mean? Well, it lowers the barrier for people so they can supply more goods and services. If we reduce taxes on businesses and people, then people will work more and they'll have more money to spend, which would stimulate the economy. And then the government would collect more in taxes. And that would help both the government and the person. So taking a look here at the economic recession, a Keynesian would be like what the New Deal was and how a liberal would respond to an economic recession. Supply-side economics is how a conservative would respond to a recession. So in a Keynesian, the government would deficit spend its way out of it. Like with the New Deal, we funded government projects for people to build stuff. It put people to work, gave them a paycheck, and it stimulated the economy. In a supply side or a conservative, they would cut taxes in order to encourage consumer spending as well as consumer saving and investment. Then those savings and investments are borrowed and they can create new products and services, and the government collects more in taxes on that. So back to where we were, the government also passes the Economic Recovery Act of 1981, which reduces taxes by 25%, but in compensation for reducing taxes, Reagan also has Congress and convinces Congress to cut $40 billion from the budget, mostly social programs, which conservatives don't want anyway. So Reagan also calls for the deregulation of industry in the 1980s, or removing government control over industry. So eventually regulations are taken off of airline industry, the telecommunications industry, and the banking industry regulations is lightened, which may lead to some trouble down the road, according to some people. So like I said, 1980 to 1982, there's a severe recession. Unemployment reaches as high as 10% in 1982. The policies meant to curb inflation by Paul Volcker at the Federal Reserve Board at the end of the 1970s contributes to this recession, but in 1983 the economy begins to turn around. But despite this, the number of poor people increases, and Latin and Asian immigrants are also coming to the U.S. in larger numbers, which contributes to that figure. In order to help our way out of this, Reagan, going along with a good conservative foundation, wants to increase our defense spending. This causes a large budget deficit. And a budget deficit is when you spend more than you take in taxes. A budget surplus would be the opposite. It's when you take in more in taxes than what you spend. And if you look at that, you can see in 1981, Reagan's first year, it was $79 billion. He increases it to $221 billion in 1986. And due to some laws passed in Congress, it falls again. But because of this, the national debt rises to $2 trillion. And the national debt is what we owe total. It's all of our budget deficits put together. And it has since gone up from there. You can see I've been keeping track of it the last few years. 15.6, 16.8, 17.5 trillion in May 4th, 2014, and 19.3 trillion on May 4th, 2016. And if you ever want a real-time look at this using algorithms and stuff like that, you can go to usdebtclock.org. And here's a look at the national debt from the 40s, 50s, 60s, 70s, 80s, 90s, 2000s, and because of the Iraq War in 2000s and 2010, 2020, it's expected to be up to $23 trillion. Something else, a fallout from the banking deregulation is the savings and loan crisis. Savings and loans banks start to fail in 1989, 1,000 of them. Some due to fraudulent behavior, some due to making too many risky loans, because if you make a risky loan and you don't get that money back, you're out that money. People blame Reagan and the new rights deregulation policies, and they have to spend $200 billion to bail out the banks. Other issues of the 1980s, Social Security, the amount of medicine and the people who take it, it's increasing their lifespan. So the number of elderly is growing, and the Social Security system is beginning to collect less money than it pays out. So Reagan raises the minimum retirement age and increases payroll taxes to fix that. We have a trade imbalance with Japan because all their cool electronics and Nintendos and stuff like that, the U.S. imports more and more from Japan, and their markets remain closed to American goods. Reagan places a tariff on Japanese electronics that doubles their prices in stores to try to alleviate this. But still, it continues on throughout the 1980s. And there's the air traffic controller strike, or the PATCO organization, union, goes on strike, and Reagan refuses to negotiate with them since they're violating a law that forbids federal employees from striking, and he fires all of them, which is kind of a setback for unions. But supporters of it said Reagan took a defiant stance and said he's not going to deal with this. So in 1984, Reagan's campaign motto is "It's morning again in America. It's good here. People are going to work down the road. It's a nice place to live." The economic recovery boosts the national mood and Reagan's popularity. Reagan also strengthens the conservative movement in his first term, so why wouldn't they elect him again? He also survives an assassination attempt in 1981 by John Hinckley Jr. He was shot in the chest and taken to the hospital and went through surgery and everything, and then the president woke up and saw all the doctors and said, "Well, I hope you're all Republicans." A little joke there. And he defeated in 1984 Walter Mondale and Geraldine Ferraro, who was the first woman to be nominated vice president. In his 2 terms, he appoints 3 justices to the Supreme Court, which turns the tide from the liberalism of the 1960s and 70s to more conservative practices in the 1980s. Sandra Day O'Connor becomes the first female justice. He promotes William Rehnquist, a conservative justice, to Chief Justice, and he'll stay there through the 2000s, I believe, until 2005. Also, Congress, at the end of his first term, passes the Equal Access Act. And conservative Christians love this because they say that schools don't allow Christians access to their schools for church services and whatnot. And this requires schools to allow any group equal access to their facilities. And liberals say it's a violation of church and state, you can't do it, but the Supreme Court confirms the constitutionality of it in 1990. In 1988, Reagan endorses his vice president to become president, George H.W. Bush. He has lots of foreign policy experience, but he lacks conservative support, and he calls for a kinder, gentler nation, but he uses negative campaign ads against his opponent, Michael Dukakis. He wins the election of 1988, Bush does, but the Democrats win control of both houses in Congress. Other issues of the 1980s we need to talk about, it becomes very materialistic, and people are obsessed with fitness. So yuppies are people born in the baby boom generation who make more than $40,000 a year and place an emphasis on making money and purchasing objects. The media makes fun of them, decries what they do for buying all these flashy cars and just stuff that they don't need. Physical fitness also becomes an obsession in the 1980s. People buy sportswear, vitamins, diet drinks, health club memberships, and home video becomes available with VHS, and people work out at home with dumbbells and on their living room floor in front of their television. Companies also realize that healthier employees are better employees, so they open in-house fitness centers. In 1981, NASA doesn't just shoot rockets and then have one piece of it come back. They add a spacecraft to their inventory that can take off and land like an airplane. It was called the Space Shuttle. One took off in 1986 and exploded in mid-takeoff and kills all 7 astronauts aboard. It was a very, very trying time, but Reagan gave a speech that night that comforted the grieving nation. In 1984, the Summer Olympics are held in Los Angeles, first time in 50 years that they have been held in the United States, and most communist countries boycott this, including the Soviet Union, because Carter boycotted the 1980 Games in Moscow. Also, the increase of illegal drugs both coming to the United States and being used in the United States is a problem. So reformers called for stricter penalties on drug dealers and halting the seemingly unrestricted flow of drugs into the United States. So Reagan sends the Army and the Navy to Florida to stop cocaine smuggling, but the smugglers just move their operations to the U.S.-Mexico border, and that's where we still have trouble with it today. Public education also takes a hit with the study A Nation at Risk that says that students in the U.S. are scoring lower than students in other industrialized nations. So one solution is that the government starts to issue what are called vouchers, which are like, it's money, it's checks that people can use to send their students to private school. But that assumes that private schools are better than public schools, and also liberals argue that it is taking money away that could be used to help public schools do better. And finally, we have the AIDS virus, which stands for Acquired Immunodeficiency Syndrome. It's the last stage of the HIV virus, which attacks the immune system of its victims. At first, it was spread among homosexuals and drug users, but by 1994, AIDS had killed 250,000 Americans. Reagan didn't do a lot. He didn't see it as the government's problem or position to help with this. But Bush, when he becomes president, realizes it is a pressing matter and gives money to increase funding for the research on the disease. Now today, people with AIDS can, if they have the right treatment, can live full lives. So it's not as lethal as it used to be. But in the 1990s, and the 1980s, it was a very, very pressing issue. So that's all I have for you today. Please fill out your learning targets, bring them back to class, and I will see you then. Bye-bye.